A millionaire accepts a bet to marry an obese woman for 24 hours, but he's surprised when she shows him who she really are. But before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe and comment below from where are you watching from. Today, the lights of the exclusive Skyline Club sparkled against the dark wood paneling as Ethan Blake swirled his scotch, a smug smile playing on his lips. At 42, he had everything money could buy: the penthouse apartment, the luxury cars, and a string of supermodel girlfriends who never lasted more than a few months. Tonight, he was celebrating another successful business deal, surrounded by the city's elite, who laughed at his jokes and hung on his every word. "You know what your problem is, Ethan." Lucas Martinez, his childhood friend and longtime business rival, leaned back in his leather chair. "You think everything in life can be bought and sold." Ethan laughed, adjusting his designer tie. "That's because it can be, Lucas. Name one thing that can't. Real love, real connection." Lucas took a sip of his drink, his eyes twinkling with mischief. "You wouldn't know what that was if it hit you in the face." "Please," Ethan scoffed. "Love is just another transaction. People stay together because of what they get out of it. Money, status, security. At least I'm honest about it." The other businessmen around the table nodded in agreement, but Lucas wasn't finished. He leaned forward, a challenge in his voice. "So want to put your money where your mouth is?" Ethan's eyebrows rose. He never could resist a bet, especially not from Lucas. They'd been competing since their days in private school, and Ethan had rarely lost. "What did you have in mind?" "Marry someone of my choosing for 24 hours, Lucas said. "If you go through with it, I'll donate $1 million to any charity you pick. If you back out, you make the donation." The table went quiet. Ethan's fingers tightened around his glass. 24 hours, that's it? That's it. One day of marriage to someone I choose. No backing out, no complaints. Lucas's smile widened. "Unless you're afraid." "Afraid?" Ethan barked out a laugh. "I could marry anyone for a day. Hell, I could marry anyone for an hour. It's just paperwork. So we have a deal." Lucas held out his hand. Ethan didn't hesitate. He grabbed Lucas's hand and shook it firmly. "Deal. But make it interesting at least. Don't give me some boring socialite." "Oh, don't worry," Lucas said. "You won't be bored." The next morning, Ethan's head throbbed as his driver pulled up to a small community center in one of the city's working-class neighborhoods. The building was clean but worn, with cheerful murals covering its walls and children's artwork in the windows. It was the last place Ethan expected to meet his 24-hour bride. Lucas was waiting outside, looking far too pleased with himself. "Ready to meet your future wife? Let's get this over with," Ethan muttered, following Lucas inside. The community center was buzzing with activity. Kids ran through the halls, elderly couples played cards in a corner, and somewhere someone was teaching a dance class. Lucas led Ethan to a small office, where a woman sat behind a desk deeply focused on paperwork. "Grace," Lucas called out, "your future husband is here." Grace Miller looked up, and Ethan's carefully prepared smirk froze on his face. She was nothing like the women he usually dated. In her early 30s, Grace was plus-sized, wearing a simple blouse and practical shoes. But there was something about her, a warmth in her brown eyes, a confidence in how she held herself, that made it impossible to look away. "So you're the arrogant businessman who thinks marriage is just a business deal?" Grace stood up, crossing her arms. She was shorter than Ethan, but somehow made him feel small. "Lucas told me all about your little bet." Ethan shot Lucas an annoyed look. "You weren't supposed to tell her." "Actually, I insisted on knowing," Grace said. "I don't do anything without full disclosure. And before you ask, yes, I agreed to this ridiculous arrangement, but only because Lucas promised half of that $1 million would go to this community center." "You're okay with this?" Ethan asked, thrown off balance by her directness. "I'm okay with using your ego to help. My kids get better programs and resources." Grace smiled, but there was steel in it. "The question is, are you okay with marrying someone who won't pretend to be impressed by your fancy suit and condescending attitude?" For the first time in years, Ethan felt genuinely unsettled. This wasn't how these things usually went. Women usually tried to impress him, not challenge him. But he couldn't back down now, not with Lucas watching, and certainly not in front of this woman who clearly thought so little of him. "I'm fine with it," he said, forcing a smile. "It's just 24 hours, right? How hard can it be?" Grace's laugh was genuine but held a note of warning. "Oh, Mr. Blake, you have no idea what you're in for. Lucas has planned quite a day for us. Hope you're ready to step out of your comfort zone." As they left to handle the paperwork, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just walked into something much bigger than a simple bet. Grace Miller wasn't going to be the easy conquest he'd imagined. She was going to make him work for every minute of these 24 hours. And somewhere deep inside, past all his defenses and carefully constructed walls, a small voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, that wouldn't be such a bad thing. Judge Martha Stevens peered over her reading glasses at the odd couple standing before her in her chambers. It was barely 9 in the morning, and this was already the strangest wedding she'd seen in her 30 years on the bench. The groom, Ethan Blake, stood stiffly in his $1,000 suit, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. The bride, Grace Miller, wore a simple blue dress and a smile that suggested she knew something everyone else didn't. Now, let me make... Sure, I understand this, Judge Stevens said, setting down the marriage license. You two want to get married right now with a divorce already scheduled for tomorrow morning. That's correct, Your Honor, Grace answered before Ethan could speak. We're fully aware of how unusual this is. Unusual? The judge shook her head. Honey, I've seen shotgun weddings that made more sense than this. Lucas, standing as their witness, couldn't hide his grin. I assure you, Judge Stevens, everything is legal and above board. Just unconventional. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. The judge's chambers felt too small, too stuffy. The whole situation was getting under his skin. This wasn't how he'd imagined getting married. In his mind, it would have been a huge society event with hundreds of guests and his picture in all the business magazines. Instead, he was standing in a cramped office with a woman he'd met an hour ago, about to say "I do" for a bet. Mr. Blake? Judge Stevens's voice snapped him back to reality. Are you sure you want to go through with this? Ethan glanced at Grace, who raised an eyebrow in challenge. He straightened his tie. Yes, Your Honor, I'm sure. Very well. The judge stood up. Let's proceed with the ceremony, though I must say, in all my years on the bench, I've never seen a bride look quite so amused at her own wedding. Grace's smile widened. Just enjoying the moment, Your Honor. The ceremony was brief and to the point. When Judge Stevens asked them to join hands, Ethan was surprised by the warmth of Grace's touch. Her hands were soft but strong, and for a moment, just a moment, something flickered in his chest, an unfamiliar feeling he quickly pushed aside. Do you, Ethan Blake, take Grace Miller to be your lawfully wedded wife for the next 24 hours? The judge added the last part with a slight shake of her head. I do, Ethan said, his voice more uncertain than he'd like. And do you, Grace Miller, take Ethan Blake to be your lawfully wedded husband for the same brief period? Grace squeezed Ethan's hand just slightly. I do. Then by the power vested in me by the state, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Judge Stevens closed her book. You may kiss the bride or not. Given the circumstances, a handshake might be more appropriate. Ethan looked at Grace, suddenly unsure. She rolled her eyes and stepped forward, rising on her tiptoes to place a quick, soft kiss on his cheek. Her perfume was subtle and sweet, nothing like the expensive designer fragrances he was used to. It made him think of warm kitchens and Sunday mornings. Now it's official. Lucas clapped his hands together. Excellent. Now for your first activity as a husband and wife. He pulled out an envelope. Grace, I believe you have somewhere to take your new... Husband? That's right. Grace's expression turned serious. Hope you didn't have any important meetings scheduled today, Mr. Blake, because you're about to see how the other half lives. Ethan checked his watch, a habit he couldn't break. Actually, I did have a board meeting at 11. Cancel it, Lucas interrupted. Remember our deal. No complaints, no backing out. For the next 23 hours and 45 minutes, you're Grace's husband. That means doing things her way. As they left the courthouse, Ethan's phone buzzed constantly with messages and emails. He tried to check them, but Grace plucked the phone from his hands. Part of the deal, she said, dropping his phone into her purse. You're disconnecting from your world and stepping into mine. Don't worry, your empire won't crumble in one day. You can't just take my phone, Ethan protested. I have responsibilities, and now your responsibility is to be present in this moment. Grace's voice softened slightly. Look, I know this isn't your idea of a good time, but you made a bet, and that bet is going to help a lot of people who really need it. So maybe, just maybe, you could try to approach this with an open mind. Ethan looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. Without his phone as a barrier, he noticed things he'd missed before, the kindness in her eyes, the slight sprinkle of freckles across her nose, the way she carried herself with a quiet confidence that had nothing to do with money or status. Fine, he said finally. Where are we going? First, we're going shopping, Grace said, hailing a taxi instead of calling Ethan's driver. If you're going to spend the day at my community center, you need to look the part. No offense, but that suit would make everyone uncomfortable. As they climbed into the taxi, Ethan caught Lucas's eye. His friend was watching them with a satisfied expression that made Ethan nervous. What exactly had he gotten himself into? The taxi pulled away from the curb, carrying them into a day that would change both their lives forever. Though neither of them knew it yet, this bizarre 24-hour marriage was about to become much more than just a bet. It was about to become a journey that would force both of them to question everything they thought they knew about love, worth, and what really matters in life. The thrift store's bell jingled as Grace pushed open the door, leading a very uncomfortable Ethan inside. The store was clean but cramped, packed with racks of second-hand clothing. An elderly woman behind the counter smiled warmly at Grace. "Grace, honey, twice in 1 week?" The woman's eyes landed on Ethan, taking in his expensive suit. "And who's this fellow?" "Mrs. Rodriguez, meet my husband." Grace's eyes sparkled with mischief. "We got married about an hour ago." Mrs. Rodriguez's jaw dropped. "Married? But you never said—" "It's a 24-hour marriage," Grace explained quickly. "Part of a bet that's going to help the community center. And right now we need to find him something more appropriate to wear." Ethan stood stiffly, looking at the racks of used clothing with barely concealed horror. "I don't think this is necessary. My suit is perfectly—" "Your suit costs more than most of our families make in a month," Grace cut him off. "You want to connect with these kids? You need to look like someone they can talk to, not their bank manager." Mrs. Rodriguez was already pulling items from the racks. "I think I have just the thing. A nice young man donated some barely worn clothes last week. Should be about your size." 20 minutes later, Ethan stood in front of a spotted mirror, hardly recognizing himself. The designer suit was carefully folded in a bag, replaced by well-worn jeans, a soft blue button-down shirt, and a casual jacket. The clothes were clean and decent quality, but nothing like what he usually wore. "Now you look like a regular person," Grace said, adjusting his collar. Her fingers brushed against his neck, and Ethan tried to ignore the slight shiver that ran through him at her touch. "The kids won't be intimidated by you now." "The kids," Ethan repeated. "You keep talking about these kids. What exactly am I supposed to do with them?" Grace's expression softened. "Just be real with them. These are good kids who've had tough breaks in life. They don't need another adult telling them what to do. They need someone to listen, to show them they matter." Something in her voice made Ethan look at her differently. "You really care about them, don't you? They're not just cases to me, Ethan. They're family." She picked up his discarded tie, running the silk through her fingers. "You know what your problem is. You've spent so long putting price tags on everything. You've forgotten that the most valuable things in life are free." Before Ethan could respond, Grace's phone rang. Her face fell as she answered it. "Slow down, Tommy. What happened?" Okay, stay right there. We're coming." She hung up, her expression worried. "Change of plans. One of my kids is in trouble. Consider this your first test as my 24-hour husband." They rushed out of the store and down 3 blocks to a small park. A teenage boy sat on a bench, his face bruised, his knuckles scraped. When he saw Grace, he jumped up, then stopped, short at the sight of Ethan. "Who's he?" Tommy asked suspiciously. "A friend," Grace said simply. "Want to tell me what happened?" Tommy's story came out in angry bursts. Some guys had been hassling his little sister at school. When he stood up to them, things got physical. Now the school was threatening to suspend him, which would mess up his chances for a scholarship he desperately needed. Ethan watched as Grace listened, her face showing concern but not judgment. She asked the right questions, got the full story, including names and details. Then she surprised both Tommy and Ethan by pulling out her phone and making a call. "Hello, Mr. Peterson. This is Grace Miller from the community center. Listen, we need to talk about Tommy Martinez and what really happened today." Ethan stood, back watching as Grace worked her magic. She didn't threaten or demand. Instead, she painted a picture of a good kid protecting his sister, of a student with real potential who needed support, not punishment. By the end of the call, she had arranged a meeting with the principal for the next day, and Tommy's suspension was on hold pending review. "You're amazing," Tommy said, hugging her. "I don't know what I'd do without you, Miss Grace. Just try to stay out of trouble until tomorrow, okay?" Grace ruffled his hair. "Go home, put some ice on those bruises. I'll handle this." After Tommy left, Ethan found himself staring at Grace. "How did you do that?" Do what? Fix everything so easily. Get that administrator to listen. Know exactly what to say. Grace shrugged. It's not about knowing what to say, it's about caring enough to try. Those kids at school, they're probably dealing with their own issues. Tommy's sister? She needs to know she can count on her brother. The administrator, he needs to understand. These kids are more than just problems to solve. She turned to face Ethan fully. That's what you don't get. Success isn't just about numbers in a bank account. It's about the lives you touch, the differences you make. One phone call just changed that boy's future. That's worth more than any business deal you've ever made. Ethan felt something shift inside him, like a crack appearing in a wall he hadn't even known was there. For the first time, he saw Grace. Not as the woman he had to marry for a bet, but as someone who moved through the world making it better, one small act at a time. You do this every day? He asked quietly. Every day, she confirmed, and we're just getting started. Ready to see what else this day has in store for us, husband? The way she said husband, with a mix of teasing and challenge, made Ethan's heart beat a little faster. He looked down at his thrift store clothes, then back at this remarkable woman who was turning his world upside down. Lead the way, he said, and for the first time since this crazy day began, he actually meant it. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows of the Hope Community Center as Grace led Ethan through its worn but cheerful hallways. The walls were covered with children's artwork, inspirational quotes, and photos of smiling faces. The sound of laughter and chatter filled the air. Welcome to my real home, Grace said, gesturing around her. It's not much compared to your penthouse, but we make magic happen here. Before Ethan could respond, a small whirlwind in the form of a 7-year-old girl crashed into Grace's legs. Miss Grace! Miss Grace! I got an A on my math test! That's wonderful, Maria! Grace knelt down to the little girl's level, her face lighting up. See, I told you all that practice would pay off. Maria noticed Ethan and half hid behind Grace, suddenly shy. Who's that? This is my friend Mr. Blake. He's going to help us today. Grace winked at the girl. He's actually pretty good at math too. Maybe he can help you with your multiplication tables later. Ethan, who usually avoided children like the plague, found himself being evaluated by Maria's serious brown eyes. Do you know how to multiply big numbers? She asked skeptically. Yes, I do, he answered, surprised to find himself kneeling down beside Grace. Would you like me to show you a trick for multiplying by nines? Maria's eyes widened with interest, and before Ethan knew what was happening, he was sitting at a small table, showing her how to use her fingers to solve multiplication problems. Grace watched from across the room, a small smile playing on her lips. The afternoon unfolded in a blur of activity. Grace introduced Ethan to dozens of people, elderly folks who came for companionship, teenagers doing homework, young mothers attending parenting classes. Each person had a story and Grace knew them all. Mrs. Chen here is teaching our cooking classes, Grace explained, introducing him to a tiny woman with a fierce smile. Her dumplings are famous in 3 neighborhoods. You too skinny, Mrs. Chen declared, poking Ethan in the ribs. All that fancy restaurant food, no good. You come to my class, I teach you real cooking. In the teen room, Ethan met James, a quiet 16-year-old who hunched over a beaten-up laptop. James is our computer genius, Grace said proudly. He's teaching himself coding from YouTube videos. Ethan looked at the ancient computer the boy was working with. That processor must be 10 years old. We take what we can get, Grace said quietly. Most of our equipment comes from donations. Something twisted in Ethan's chest as he watched James squint at the dim screen. He thought about the 3 top-of-the-line laptops sitting unused in his home office. The real eye-opener came when Grace showed him the center's budget. They were sitting in her small office, looking at spreadsheets that made Ethan's accountant's heart hurt. How do you manage all this on so little? He asked, genuinely shocked. The entire center's annual budget was less than what he spent on his car. We stretch every dollar until it screams, Grace said, her usual humor giving way to seriousness. Have bake sales, apply for grants, beg for donations. Some months it's harder than others. Last winter, our heating bill almost broke us. Ethan looked up from the papers to find Grace staring out the window, watching as a group of kids played basketball on the cracked court outside. These people depend on us, she said softly. For some of them, we're all they have. The teens need a safe place to study. The seniors need somewhere to feel useful. The little ones need help with homework and a hot meal after school. And what do you need? The question slipped out before Ethan could stop it. Grace turned to him, surprised. What? You give so much to everyone else. What do you need? For the first time since he'd met her, Grace seemed at a loss for words. I need this place to survive. I need to know that Maria will keep getting A's on her math tests, that James will have a chance to become the programmer he dreams of being, that Mrs. Chen will keep teaching young mothers how to cook healthy meals on a budget. Ethan stood up and walked to the window, standing beside her. Outside, the kids were laughing, the sound carrying through the thin glass. You know, he said slowly, my company has a foundation. We're always looking for worthwhile causes to support. Grace stiffened beside him. We don't need your charity, Ethan. It's not charity, he said, surprising himself with his intensity. It's investment in the future, in people. Isn't that what you've been trying to teach me all day? Before Grace could respond, a commotion erupted in the hallway. They rushed out to find two teenagers squared off, fists clenched, angry words filling the air. Without hesitation, Grace stepped between them. Marcus! Devon! What's going on? The boys started talking at once, their voices rising. Ethan watched in amazement as Grace handled the situation with a mixture of firmness and compassion. Within minutes, she had them sitting down, talking it out. The argument, it turned out, was over a girl they both liked. Remember what we talked about? Grace asked them. About handling emotions. Use words, not fists, Marcus mumbled. And, Grace prompted. Respect each other's feelings, Devon added. Good. Grace smiled at them. Now, how about you both help Mr. Blake set up for the afternoon snack program? Working together might help you see you have more in common than you think. Before Ethan knew what was happening, he was in the center's small kitchen, supervising as Marcus and Devon prepared sandwiches for the after-school program. Watching them work, gradually moving from sullen silence to cautious conversation, he began to understand what Grace had been saying about making a difference. Later, as they watched the kids enjoy their snacks, Grace bumped her shoulder against his. You're pretty good at this, you know. At what? Being human. She smiled up at him. Who knew there was a real person under all that expensive armor? Ethan felt his face grow warm. Maybe I just needed someone to show me how. The look Grace gave him then made his heart skip a beat. But before either of them could say more, Lucas appeared in the doorway. Time for the next part of your adventure, he announced. Hope you're ready for a black tie dinner, Grace. And Ethan, your regular clothes are in my car. Can't have you showing up at the Children's Hospital Gala in thrift store wear. Grace's eyes widened. The gala? But that's one of the biggest charity events of the year. I couldn't possibly. You can and you will, Lucas insisted. After all, you're Mrs. Blake for the evening, and wait until you hear what table you're seated at. As they prepared to leave, Ethan watched Grace say goodbye to everyone, giving hugs, making promises, checking one last time that everything was in order. In just one afternoon, his view of her and of himself had shifted dramatically. Now he had to wonder how would she handle his world. I look ridiculous, Grace said, staring at her reflection in the full-length mirror of the hotel's powder room. Lucas had arranged for a last-minute appointment at an exclusive boutique, and now she barely recognized herself in the midnight blue evening gown that hugged her curves. Her hair had been styled into elegant waves, and a professional makeup artist had worked magic on her face. You look beautiful, said the boutique owner, who had stayed to help her dress. That color was made for you. Grace touched the soft fabric uncertainly. The price tag on this dress could have funded the community center's after-school program for a month. It's just not me. Sometimes it's good to be someone else for a night, the owner said kindly. Besides, your husband's jaw's going to drop when he sees you. Grace's heart fluttered at the word husband, even though she knew it was temporary. The afternoon at the community center had shown her a different side of Ethan, one that had surprised and intrigued her. But now they were heading into his world and she couldn't help feeling nervous. A knock at the door made her jump. Grace? It was Lucas. Everyone's waiting. Are you ready? Taking a deep breath, Grace opened the door. Lucas's eyes widened. Well, who knew our social worker could clean up so nice? Don't be a jerk, Grace muttered, but she was smiling. Seriously, Grace, you look stunning. Ethan's not going. To know what hit him. The ballroom of the Grand Plaza Hotel was a scene out of a movie. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, illuminating tables dressed in white linens and decorated with elaborate flower arrangements. The city's wealthiest and most powerful people milled about in designer clothes, sipping champagne and making small talk. Ethan stood near the entrance, back in his expensive suit, checking his watch. When he looked up and saw Grace, he went completely still. The look on his face made Grace's cheeks warm. For once, the smooth-talking businessman seemed at a loss for words. "Grace, you look different," she supplied. "Incredible," he corrected, offering his arm. "Although you look just as beautiful in jeans at the community center." The sincerity in his voice surprised her. "Careful, Mr. Blake. Someone might think you're actually enjoying our fake marriage." Something flickered in his eyes. But before he could respond, they were surrounded by people eager to greet him. Grace watched as Ethan switched into business mode, making introductions, handling social niceties with practiced ease. "And this is your wife?" a woman in diamonds asked, eyeing Grace with barely concealed curiosity. "We had no idea you were even dating someone, Ethan." "It was a whirlwind romance," Ethan said smoothly, his hand finding the small of Grace's back. The warm pressure of his touch sent tingles up her spine. "What do you do, dear?" another woman asked with a hint of condescension. "I run a community center in the East Side neighborhood," Grace answered proudly. "We provide educational support, meals, and various programs for families in need. To also charity work." "How nice." The woman's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Actually," Ethan cut in, his voice carrying an edge Grace hadn't heard before, "Grace's center does incredible work. They're changing lives with barely any resources. In fact, I was thinking of having the Blake Foundation take a serious look at supporting their programs." The women's attitudes shifted instantly, and soon Grace found herself the center of attention. As she described her work, she noticed something changing in her audience's expressions. The condescension faded, replaced by genuine interest. Even the most jaded socialites seemed touched by stories about Maria's math achievements and James's coding dreams. During dinner, Grace found herself seated between Ethan and the hospital's chief of pediatrics. As they discussed the challenges facing both their organizations, Grace felt Ethan's eyes on her. Every time she glanced his way, he was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. The evening's entertainment began, a charity auction to raise funds for the children's hospital. Grace watched in amazement as hundreds of thousands of dollars were pledged with casual waves of auction paddles. "And now," the auctioneer announced, "a special item, a complete technology upgrade for one deserving community organization. This package includes new computers, tablets, educational software, and a year of technical support." Grace's heart leaped. Something like that could transform her center's programs. But the starting bid was more money than she'd ever seen in one place. To her shock, Ethan's paddle went up, then up again, and again. She grabbed his arm. "What are you doing?" "Investing in the future," he said quietly, never taking his eyes off the auctioneer. "Isn't that what you taught me?" When the gavel finally fell, Ethan had won the package. The entire ballroom erupted in applause. But Grace barely heard it. She was too busy trying not to cry. "Why?" she whispered as they walked onto the dance floor for the evening's first dance. Ethan pulled her close, one hand on her waist, the other holding hers. "You know what I realized today? I've spent my whole life chasing success, thinking it was about power and money. But watching you with those kids, seeing how you change lives with so little, it made me question everything." Grace looked up at him, seeing real emotion in his eyes. "Ethan, when James showed me his coding projects on that ancient laptop, all I could think about was how much more he could do with the right tools. When Maria got so excited about math, I remembered how I felt at her age, discovering I had a talent for numbers. You give these kids hope, Grace. The least I can do is give them the resources to chase their dreams." They danced in silence for a moment, swaying to the soft music. Grace was acutely aware of how close they were, of the warmth of his hand on her back, of the way he'd changed in just a few hours. "You know," she said finally, "when Lucas told me about this bet, I thought you were just another rich jerk playing games with people's lives. I never expected..." "Never expected what?" Grace met his eyes. "Never expected to wish these 24 hours wouldn't end." The look they shared then was filled with possibilities. Neither of them had imagined that morning. But before either could speak, Lucas appeared beside them. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, not looking sorry at all. "But there's someone who'd like to meet Grace. The mayor's wife is very interested in community outreach programs." As Grace was led away to meet more influential people, she glanced back at Ethan. He stood watching her, and in his eyes she saw the same truth she was beginning to accept. This had stopped being a game somewhere along the way. The question was, what would happen when their 24 hours were up? The city lights twinkled below as Ethan's car wound its way through the streets. After the gala, Neither of them had been ready for the evening to end. Now they found themselves heading to a small Italian restaurant Ethan knew, the kind of place that stayed open late and didn't care about evening gowns or tuxedos. "I can't believe you bid on that technology package," Grace said, still processing everything that had happened at the gala. She'd removed her borrowed jewelry, but was still wearing the beautiful blue gown. "That was more money than our center sees in a year." Ethan loosened his bow tie, looking more relaxed than he had all evening. "Actually, I was thinking it might not be enough. Your center needs more than just computers. The heating system you mentioned, the basketball court. There's so much potential there." "Ethan," Grace touched his arm, making him look at her. "Why are you really doing this?" He was quiet for a moment, watching the city pass by. "You know what struck me today? When that fight broke out at the center, you didn't just stop it. You turned it into a teaching moment. Those boys walked away better than they were before. You do that all day, every day. You make people better. And that surprised you? It made me realize how little I've done with all my success." He parked the car in front of a small, warmly lit restaurant. "I make money, I close deals, but what do I actually contribute to?" "The world." The restaurant was nearly empty at this late hour. An elderly man greeted Ethan like an old friend, leading them to a quiet corner booth. The tablecloth was checkered red and white, and a candle flickered between them. "I come here sometimes when I need to think," Ethan admitted after they'd ordered. "It reminds me of where I started, before the penthouse and the company. My father used to take me to a place like this." "Tell me about him," Grace said softly. "He was a math teacher, loved numbers, loved teaching kids how to see the patterns in them. That's where I got my head for business. But somewhere along the way, I forgot the joy he found in simply helping others learn." Grace reached across the table and took his hand. "It's not too late to remember." The touch of her hand sent warmth spreading through his chest. "When I saw you teaching Maria that math trick today, for a moment, I saw my dad. He would have loved your center, loved what you do there." "What happened to him?" "Cancer 10 years ago." Ethan's voice grew quiet. "I was just starting to make it big. Kept telling myself I was too busy to visit more often. By the time I realized what mattered, it was too late." Grace squeezed his hand. "He'd be proud of what you did tonight." "Would he?" Ethan looked at their joined hands. "Or would he be ashamed it took a bet to make me see what was right in front of me?" Their food arrived. Simple pasta dishes that smelled like heaven. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, both lost in thought. "Can I ask you something?" Ethan said finally. "Why did you agree to this? The bet, the marriage, all of it?" Grace twirled pasta on her fork, considering. "At first it was just about the money for the center. But then I saw something in your eyes when we met. A loneliness you tried to hide behind all that confidence. It reminded me of some of my kids, the ones who act tough because they're afraid to let anyone see who they really are. And now?" His voice was barely a whisper. "Now I'm not sure of anything." She met his eyes across the candle flame. "Except that this doesn't feel like a bet anymore." The waiter appeared with tiramisu. They hadn't ordered. "On the house," he said with a wink. "For the beautiful couple." They both started to protest, to explain this wasn't real, but the words wouldn't come, because somewhere between the morning's awkward ceremony and this quiet moment, something had shifted, something neither of them had expected. "Tell me about your dreams," Ethan said suddenly. "Not the center's needs or the kids' futures. Your dreams. What does Grace want?" The question caught her off guard. I'm not sure anyone's asked me that in a long time. I'm asking now." Grace looked down at her dessert, gathering her thoughts. "I dream about expanding the center, not just helping kids with homework, but really giving them opportunities. Art classes, music programs, proper college prep. I dream about reaching more. Families having enough resources to help everyone who needs it." She paused, then added softly, "And sometimes I dream about finding someone who sees me, not just what I do, but who I am." "I see you," Ethan said, his voice rough with emotion. "I see how your eyes light up when you talk about your work. I see how you carry everyone's burdens, but never complain about the weight. I see how beautiful you are, not because of this dress or the makeup, but because of the light that shines from inside you." Grace felt tears threatening. "Ethan, I know this started as a game," he continued, reaching for her hand again. "But sitting here with you, talking like this, I've never felt more real in my life." A clock somewhere struck midnight. They both jumped slightly, suddenly aware of how late it was. "We should probably go," Grace said reluctantly. "Big day, tomorrow at the center." Right, the center. Ethan signaled for the check. I'll drive you home. But as they walked to his car, neither of them wanted the evening to end. The city had grown quiet around them, and the night felt full of possibilities. They had 12 more hours of their pretend marriage. 12 hours to figure out if what they were feeling was real or just part of the game. As they drove through the empty streets, Grace found herself watching Ethan's profile in the dim light. This morning she'd thought she had him figured out, just another rich man playing with people's lives. Now she wasn't sure of anything except the way her heart beat faster when he looked at her. They pulled up outside her apartment building, but neither made a move to get out of the car. The moment felt fragile, balanced on the edge of something neither of them had expected to find. "Grace," Ethan began, turning to face her. But before he could finish, both their phones buzzed with urgent messages. Something was happening at the community center, something that would force them to confront not just their growing feelings, but the very different worlds they came from. Grace's hands shook as she read the text message. "It's Tommy. He's at the center with his sister. Their mum's boyfriend showed up drunk again, and they had to get out of the house." Ethan was already turning the car around. "Tell them we're on our way." The streets were almost empty at this late hour, allowing them to reach the community center in record time. They found Tommy and his 13-year-old sister Lisa huddled on the front steps. Lisa had clearly been crying, and Tommy's face showed fresh bruises, different from the ones he'd had that afternoon. "Miss Grace!" Lisa ran to her, throwing herself into Grace's arms. Grace held her tight, looking over the girl's shoulder at Tommy. "What happened?" she asked quietly. "Mom's boyfriend started throwing things," Tommy said, his voice tight with anger. "When I tried to stop him, he gestured to his face. Lisa was scared, so we ran." Ethan had been hanging back, but now he stepped forward. "Are you hurt anywhere else? Should we take you to the hospital?" Tommy shook his head. "I'm okay. Just couldn't let him near Lisa." Grace was already unlocking the center's door. "Come inside. Let's get some ice on those bruises and figure this out." The center felt different at night, quieter, but somehow safer. Grace led them to the small kitchen where she kept a first aid kit. As she tended to Tommy's injuries, Ethan made hot chocolate for everyone. The domestic normalcy of the moment struck Grace. Here was a man who hours ago had bid thousands at a charity gala, now carefully adding marshmallows to cheap ceramic mugs. "What are we going to do?" Lisa asked in a small voice. "We can't go. Home, not with him there." "You'll stay here tonight," Grace said firmly. "We have the emergency cots in the storage room. Tomorrow we'll—" "Actually," Ethan interrupted, "I have a better idea." He pulled out his phone and made a call. "Sarah, sorry to wake you. Remember that favor you owe me. I need to use it now." 20 minutes later, a woman in her 50s arrived at the center. She introduced herself as Sarah Chen, director of a nearby women's shelter. "We have 2 rooms available," she told Grace. "Private, secure, with counselors on staff. They can stay as long as they need to." "But our mom," Lisa started to protest. "We'll contact her in the morning," Sarah assured her. "Let her know you're safe. If she wants to join you, we have space. For her too." Grace watched as Sarah gently explained the shelter's services to the siblings. She felt Ethan's presence beside her, solid and supportive. "How did you know?" she asked quietly. "My foundation helps fund several shelters," he replied. "Sarah's is the best. I've never seen her turn anyone away." Tommy was still hesitant. "But what about school? My job at the grocery store?" "We'll figure it all out," Grace promised. "One step at a time. Right now you both need rest and safety." As Sarah prepared to take the kids to the shelter, Lisa hugged Grace tight. "Thank you," she whispered. Then, to everyone's surprise, she hugged Ethan too. "You're not as scary as you look," she told him with a hint of a smile. After they left, Grace sank into a chair, emotionally drained. The beautiful gown she still wore seemed absurd now, like a costume from another life. "How often does this happen?" Ethan asked, sitting beside her. "Too often." Grace ran a hand through her carefully styled hair, not caring that she was ruining it. "We do what we can, but there's never enough. Never enough beds, never enough counselors, never enough resources to help everyone who needs it." Ethan was quiet for a moment, then said, "You know, the Blake Foundation has been looking to expand its domestic violence prevention programs." Grace turned to him sharply. Don't what? Don't make promises just because you're feeling emotional right now. This isn't a game, Ethan. These are real people's lives." "I know that." He reached for her hand. "That's exactly why I'm saying this. Tonight wasn't about emotion. It was about seeing reality. Your reality. The one you live every day. Grace looked at their joined hands. In a few hours, this marriage will be over. You'll go back to your world and I'll go back to mine. What if I don't want to? The question hung in the air between them. Grace's heart hammered in her chest. What are you saying? I'm saying that somewhere between that ridiculous ceremony this morning and watching you care for those kids tonight, something changed. I changed. He turned to face her fully. You asked me not to make promises based on emotion? Fine, let's talk business. Your center needs sustainable funding. My foundation needs legitimate, effective programs to support. That's just facts. And us? Grace hardly dared to ask. Is that just business too? Instead of answering, Ethan reached out and tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. His touch was gentle, almost reverent. Grace Miller, he said softly, you are the least businesslike thing that's ever happened to me. You walked into my life on a bet and turned everything upside down. You made me question every value I thought I had. You showed me what real strength looks like. Ethan, let me finish. His eyes were intense in the dim light. Tomorrow morning, our 24 hours will be up. The bet will be over. But I don't want this, us, to end. Not now. Not when I'm just starting to understand what really matters. Grace felt tears threatening again. This is crazy. We barely know each other. No, he disagreed. We've seen each other at our most real. You saw past my wealth and status to call me out on my prejudices. I saw past first impressions to discover the most remarkable woman I've ever met. What's crazy is pretending we can just walk away from that. A noise outside made them both jump. Just a car passing by. But it broke the spell of the moment, reminding them of the late hour and the reality of their situation. We should go, Grace said reluctantly. It's late. And tomorrow we face the real world, Ethan finished. Together? The question held so much more than just the word itself. Grace looked at him, really looked at him. The man she'd met this morning wouldn't have known how to handle tonight's crisis, wouldn't have known who to call or what to do. But this Ethan, the one sitting beside her in his rumpled tuxedo with concern still etched on his face for two scared teenagers, this was someone different. Together, she agreed softly. But Ethan, whatever happens tomorrow, promise me one thing, anything. Promise me this wasn't just a bet to you anymore. His answer came not in words, but in the way he drew her close, his lips finding hers in a kiss that felt like coming home. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Grace knew that whatever came next, their lives would never be the same. As they left the center, the night sky was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. In a few hours, their pretend marriage would end, but something real, something neither of them had expected, was just beginning. The sun was rising over the city as Grace stepped out of her apartment building, wearing fresh clothes and trying not to think about how little sleep she'd gotten. After the crisis at the community center, Ethan had insisted on driving her home, their goodbye lingering in a way that made her heart flutter every time she thought about it. Now, just a few hours later, he was back, waiting beside his car with 2 cups of coffee and a paper bag that smelled like fresh pastries. You didn't have to come get me, she said, but couldn't hide her smile as he handed her a coffee. I could have met you at the courthouse. 3 more hours, Ethan said quietly. I want to make them count. The coffee was exactly how she liked it, something he must have noticed yesterday during their time together. It was these little details that kept catching her off guard, making her question everything she'd initially thought about him. I called Sarah, he said as they drove. Tommy and Lisa are settled in. Their mother called this morning asking about them. Sarah thinks she might be ready to leave too. Grace felt tears prick her eyes. That's wonderful. Sometimes they just need to know there's a way out. Sarah also mentioned the shelters looking to expand their youth programs. Ethan glanced at her. They could use someone with experience running community programs. Ethan, just thinking out loud, but his small smile told her he was doing more than that. He was building bridges between their worlds, looking for ways to make this, whatever this was between them, work. They pulled up in front of the community center. Grace was surprised. She'd expected them to head straight to the courthouse to end their temporary marriage. I thought we could check on things here first, Ethan explained. Make sure everything's ready for the day. Inside on Mrs. Her eyes widened when she saw them together. Grace and Mr. Blake, I didn't expect. I thought after yesterday. We're still married for a few more hours, Grace said, trying to keep her voice light despite the weight in her chest. And after that, Mrs. Rodriguez asked, looking between them with knowing eyes. Before either could answer, the front door burst open. James, the teenage computer enthusiast, rushed in with excitement written all over his face. "Miss Grace, did you see the news about the technology donation from the gala?" He was practically bouncing. "They're saying we're getting new computers and tablets," and he stopped short when he saw Ethan. "Wait, that was you?" Ethan shifted uncomfortably. "The center deserves proper equipment." James looked at him with new eyes. Would you maybe look at some of my coding projects? When the new computers come, I've been working on this app idea, but I never had the right tools to really develop it. The hope in the boy's voice made Grace's heart ache. She watched as Ethan knelt slightly to be at eye level with James. "Tell you what," he said, "once the new equipment is set up, I'll introduce you to my company's head of software development. If your app idea is good, and I bet it is, maybe we can talk about an internship program." James's eyes went wide. "Really, you mean it?" "I never make promises I don't intend to keep," Ethan said, and Grace knew he wasn't just talking to James. More people began arriving, the regular morning crowd of seniors coming for coffee and companionship, mothers dropping off children before work, teenagers grabbing breakfast before school. Each person who recognized Ethan from yesterday greeted him with increasing warmth. "Mr. Blake," Maria came running in with her math homework. "I did all the multiplication problems, even the hard ones." Grace watched as Ethan sat down with the little girl, checking her work with genuine interest. He looked so natural here now, as if he belonged. It was hard to believe this was the same man who'd walked in yesterday morning, looking at everything with barely concealed disdain. "Time check," Lucas's voice came from the doorway. He'd arrived unnoticed, watching the scene with obvious satisfaction. 1 hour until your appointment at the courthouse." Reality crashed back in. In 1 hour, their 24-hour marriage would officially end. The bet would be over. Everything would go back to normal, except nothing felt normal anymore. "I need some air," Grace said suddenly, heading for the back door that led to the small garden area. She heard Ethan excuse himself and follow her. The garden was really just a small patch of green with a few benches and some potted plants the seniors tended. Grace sat heavily on one of the benches, trying to sort through her emotions. "Grace," Ethan's voice was gentle as he sat beside her. "Talk to me. How did this happen?" She turned to look at him. "Yesterday morning you walked in here like you were slumming it, taking on a bet you thought you couldn't lose. And now I can't imagine walking away." He took her hand. "Is that what you're afraid of? That I'll leave? Wouldn't you? This isn't your world, Ethan. Your life is boardrooms and galas and million-dollar deals. Mine is homework, help in crisis interventions, and stretching every dollar until it screams. Maybe I need both." His grip on her hand tightened. "Maybe we both do. You saw me at the gala last night. I can help your center in ways you never could alone. And you, Grace, you make me want to be better, to do better." And what happens when the novelty wears off? When helping the community isn't exciting anymore? When you realize that being with someone like me might hurt your image in your world? Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled out his phone and pulled up a news website. The headline read, "Tech mogul makes surprise bid at Children's Hospital Gala. Sources say romance may be behind generous donation." "They're already talking," he said. "About us, about the donation, about why a man like me would suddenly take interest in community programs." He put the phone away. "Let them talk." "Ethan, no, listen to me." He turned to face her fully. "My whole life, I thought, success meant making money, closing deals, being the most powerful person in the room. Then you came along and showed me what real success looks like. It looks like Tommy protecting his sister, like James learning to code on a broken laptop because he refuses to give up on his dreams, like you, fighting every day to give people hope." Tears were falling freely now, but Grace didn't try to stop them. "You really mean that?" "With all my heart." He reached up to wipe away her tears. "The bet's over, Grace. I don't care about winning or losing anymore. I just care about you." The garden was quiet except for the distant sounds of the center coming to life inside. The morning sun painted everything in soft gold, making the moment feel almost magical. "So what do we do now?" Grace asked softly. Ethan smiled. Not his business smile, but the real one she'd come to know over the past day. "First, we go to the courthouse. We end this marriage that started as a game. And then I'd like to take you to dinner. A real dinner, not part of any bet. Just two people getting to know each other properly." He squeezed her hand. "What do you say?" Before Grace could answer, Lucas appeared at the garden door. "It's time," he said quietly. They stood together, still, holding hands. The next hour would end their official marriage, but as they walked back into the center, Grace realized something. Sometimes the end of one story is just the beginning of a better one. The courthouse seemed colder and more imposing than it had. Just 24 hours ago, Grace sat on a hard wooden bench outside Judge Stevens's chambers, smoothing non-existent wrinkles from her skirt. Beside her, Ethan was uncharacteristically quiet, his usual confidence replaced by something that looked almost like uncertainty. Lucas paced in front of them, checking his watch every few minutes. "Well," he said finally, "I suppose congratulations are in order. You made it the full 24 hours. Lucas," Ethan's voice held a warning, "this isn't the time." "Oh, I think it's exactly the time." Lucas stopped pacing and faced them. "You two realize what happened here, right? This was supposed to be a simple bet, a lesson in humility for my arrogant friend. Instead," he gestured between them, "instead, I think I accidentally played matchmaker." Grace felt her cheeks warm. "It's not that simple, isn't it?" Lucas sat down across from them. "Ethan, I've known you since we were kids. When's the last time you spent a whole day without checking the stock market? When's the last time you put someone else's needs before your business interests?" Ethan started to protest, but Lucas held up a hand. "And Grace, I did my research before proposing this bet. You're known for being careful, practical, always putting the center's needs first. Yet here you are contemplating something completely impractical, something that could complicate everything you've worked for. What's your point, Lucas?" Ethan asked, his hand finding Grace's almost unconsciously. "My point is that maybe this bet was actually God's plan, or fate, or whatever you want to call it." Lucas smiled. "Sometimes the craziest decisions lead us exactly where we need to be." Before either could respond, Judge Stevens's door opened. Her assistant beckoned them inside. The judge was reviewing their paperwork when they entered, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. "Well," she said, looking up at them, "this might be the first marriage I've both started and ended in 24 hours. She shuffled through the documents. "Everything seems to be in order. Once you both sign these papers, the marriage will be officially dissolved. No waiting period required given the unusual circumstances." Grace stared at the papers on the judge's desk. Just a few signatures and everything would go back to normal. Yet normal suddenly seemed like the last thing she wanted. "Before we proceed," Judge Stevens said, removing her glasses, "I have to ask, are you both certain this is what you want?" The question hung in the air. Grace felt Ethan tense beside her. "Actually, Your Honor," Ethan said slowly, "would it be possible to have a moment alone to discuss this?" The judge nodded, a knowing look in her eyes. "Take all the time you need. My assistant will show you to the conference room." Once alone in the small conference room, Grace and Ethan faced each other. Through the window, the city sprawled before them, his world of high-rises and corporate offices blending seamlessly with her neighborhood of community centers and family-owned businesses. 24 hours ago, Ethan said softly, "I thought I had everything figured out. Money, power, success. I could define each one down to the dollar. Now," he shook his head, "now I'm not sure of anything except how I feel when I'm with you." Grace's heart hammered in her chest. "Ethan, we can't just—" "Why not?" He stepped closer. "Why can't we take this crazy thing that started as a bet and turn it into something real? Because it's insane. We come from completely different worlds." The gossip columns would have a field day, your business associates. "Let them talk." Ethan's voice was firm. "You want to know what I realized last night? Watching you with Tommy and Lisa. I realized that all my success, all my wealth meant nothing if I couldn't use it to make a real difference. You showed me that." Grace felt tears threatening. "You can make a difference without me. Your foundation. I don't want to do it without you." He took her hands in his. "These past 24 hours have been the most real, most meaningful hours of my life. When I'm with you, I'm not the CEO or the millionaire. I'm just a man who's falling in love with an amazing woman." The word love made Grace's breath catch. "You can't possibly—" "Why not? Because it's too fast, too improbable." He smiled. "Grace Miller, you've spent the last 24 hours turning everything I thought I knew upside down. Why should this be any different? The center will have all the support it needs, whether you're my wife or not. That's not what this is about." He cupped her face gently. "This is about us. about how right this feels, even though it makes no sense on paper. Grace looked into his eyes, seeing nothing but sincerity. What exactly are you saying? I'm saying let's tear up those dissolution papers. Let's take this marriage that started as a bet and give it a real chance. His thumb brushed away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. I'm saying I don't want these 24 hours to end. People will think we're crazy. Probably. His smile widened. But I've spent my whole life being sensible, making the smart business decision. For once, I want to make the heart decision. Grace's own heart felt like it might burst. Every practical consideration, every logical argument for ending this now fought against the undeniable rightness she felt in his arms. If we do this, she said slowly, there have to be ground rules. The center stays independent. No trying to fix everything with money. And I need to know this isn't just some rich man's whim, that you won't wake up in a month and realize this was all a mistake. Counter-offer, Ethan said, slipping naturally into negotiation mode. The center gets a guaranteed annual grant from the Blake Foundation. No strings attached. I'll help where I can, but you maintain full control. And as for waking up and regretting this, he pulled her closer. The only mistake would be walking away from the best thing that's ever happened to me. A knock at the door made them jump apart. Lucas poked his head in. Judge Stevens is waiting. Have you made a decision? Grace looked at Ethan, saw the hope and love in his eyes. In 24 hours, he had transformed from a man who thought everything could be bought to someone who understood the true value of things that couldn't be measured in dollars. And she had gone from seeing him as an arrogant businessman to recognizing the caring, passionate man beneath the expensive suits. Maybe Lucas was right. Maybe sometimes the craziest decisions lead us exactly where we need to be. Taking a deep breath, Grace turned to Lucas with a smile. Yes, she said, we have. 3 months later, the Hope Community Center was buzzing with activity. New computers hummed in the technology lab, where James led a coding club for younger kids. The basketball court had been resurfaced, and the heating system worked perfectly. But the biggest change wasn't in the building, it was in the people. Grace stood in her office doorway, watching as Ethan helped Maria with her mathematics homework. He came here every afternoon now, leaving his corporate duties behind to spend time with the kids who had stolen his heart, just as surely as Grace had. Remember what I told you about decimals, he was saying. Think of them like slicing a pizza. If you cut it into 10 pieces, Maria's face lit up with understanding. Oh, so 3/10 is like having 3 slices. Exactly. Ethan's proud smile made Grace's heart warm. You're getting really good at this. Mum says I might be able to go to college someday, Maria said hopefully. Like James is going to. You absolutely can, Ethan assured her. And you know what? When you're ready, there might just be a scholarship with your name on it. Grace smiled, remembering how Ethan had established the Hope Scholarship Fund, ensuring that kids from the center would have the chance at higher education. It wasn't about throwing money at problems anymore. It was about creating real, sustainable opportunities. Tommy and Lisa's mother had left her abusive boyfriend and moved into her own apartment with help from Sarah's shelter program. Tommy was interning at Blake Enterprises now, learning about business operations while still helping out at the center. Lisa had started a support group for other teens dealing with domestic violence. Mrs. Blake, Mrs. Rodriguez called out, still delighting in using Grace's new name. The caterers are here to discuss the anniversary celebration. The center was preparing for its 20th anniversary gala, the first major fundraiser since Grace and Ethan's wedding. Real wedding, that is. They'd had a proper ceremony 2 months ago, with all the center's kids as honorary attendants, and Judge Stevens officiating again, this time with a knowing smile. Send them in, Grace called back, but her eyes were still on Ethan and Maria. Later that evening, after the center had quieted down, Grace and Ethan sat in their favorite spot in the small garden. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold. Lucas called today, Ethan said, his arm around her shoulders. He wanted to know if we're still mad at him for that bet. Grace laughed. Mad at him? We should send him a thank you gift. I already did. Made $1 million donation to his favorite charity in his name. Ethan grinned. He said that wasn't what he meant, but he'll take it. Speaking of Lucas's bet, Grace turned to face her husband. Do you ever regret it? Choosing this life? The gossip columns still love to talk about how the great Ethan Blake married a common social worker and spends his afternoons teaching math to kids instead of closing billion-dollar deals. Ethan's face grew serious. Grace, in the 3 months since we got married, really married, my company's profits have actually increased. Want to know why? She raised an eyebrow questioningly. Because for the first time, I'm not just chasing money. I'm building something meaningful. Our corporate giving program has improved employee satisfaction. Our community involvement has enhanced our public image. Even our shareholders are happy because it turns out doing good is good for business. He pulled her closer. But none of that matters compared to what I've gained personally. Every morning, I wake up next to the most beautiful, caring woman in the world. Every day I get to see lives being changed. Every night I go to bed knowing I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Even when I make you eat Mrs. Chen's experimental recipes, Grace teased. Even then, he kissed her softly. Although I could do with a little less of her extra spicy dumplings. A commotion from inside interrupted them. James burst into the garden, waving a letter excitedly. "I got in," he shouted. "MIT accepted me. Full scholarship." Grace jumped up to hug him, tears of joy in her eyes. Ethan shook James's hand proudly. "The internship recommendation probably didn't hurt," Ethan said with a wink. "Are you kidding?" James was practically bouncing. "Your head of development said my app prototype was one of the best he's seen from someone my age. He wants to keep working with me even while I'm at college." After James left to share his news with everyone else, Grace and Ethan remained in the garden. The first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. "A year ago," Grace said softly, "I never would have believed any of this was possible. The center was struggling, our kids had limited opportunities, and she smiled up at her husband. "I thought all rich businessmen were cold-hearted jerks, and I thought love was just another transaction." Ethan pulled her into his arms. "Funny how betting on love turned out to be the best investment I ever made." Inside the center, they could hear the sounds of celebration as word of James's acceptance spread. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to help, new lives to touch. But for now, they stood together in their garden, two people from different worlds who had found something rare and precious, a love that made both their worlds better. "Oh," Grace suddenly remembered something. "Maria asked me today if we're going to have a baby soon. Apparently the kids have a betting pool going." Ethan laughed, then saw her expression. "Grace, is there something you want to tell me?" Her smile was radiant in the gathering dusk. "Let's just say some bets are worth taking." Ethan's face lit up with joy as he pulled her into a passionate kiss. Above them the stars twinkled like diamonds, but neither of them noticed. They had found something far more valuable than any jewel. They had found a love that started with a bet, but grew into a blessing that would enrich not just their lives, but countless others for years to come. And somewhere across town, Lucas raised a glass to the success of his matchmaking bet, knowing that sometimes the greatest victories come not from winning, but from helping others find their way to love. The end.